So I want to talk a little bit about the freelance position. This talk is titled The Freelance Angle, so I want to kind of identify what that is. So what I've got here is I've got a slide with a kind of picture of a cloud with 4 ladders leading up into it. And that's, for me, is a kind of illustration of where freelancers sit in the great sort of work and funding game. Obviously, it's a gross generalisation because there are so many different models of working. But loosely speaking, you have the kind of the funders at the top who have all the money. Obviously, they have to get the money from the government, but as kind of within the sector, the funders have the money, and that kind of trickles down to organisations. Through organisations, if it's a big organisation, can trickle down through departments, and then onto projects, sometimes then farmed out to another organisation or commissioning another organisation or project, which might even then be commissioning another organisation, and gradually the work and the funding trickles down to the artists and the freelancers at the bottom. Obviously, as I say, that's a gross generalisation, and there are direct routes for freelancers to gain funding themselves or to work more directly with funders or organisations. But quite often that's how it works, which means that by the time the work and the funding gets to the freelancers, there's often less of it. And it also means it's spread quite thinly among freelancers often as well. The flip side of that, and that's something I'm going to talk quite a lot about in this, is that kind of balance and the flip sides and things sort of weighing against each other. The flip side of that is that because freelancers are at the bottom, they're not on a kind of middle rung, quite often we can be dynamic, which is obviously the word of the day, as well as enthusiasm, obviously. But we can be dynamic, we can kind of skip from ladder to ladder, we can skip up and down the rung a little bit more, because we're not in the middle, we're not kind of then often commissioning other arts organisations or other artists. Obviously we are sometimes, as I say, it's a generalisation. The other thing to think about, however, is that often freelance artists, like many of us, have dependents. Now, again, I am in the middle of this situation. I'm fortunate, I guess, in work terms that I don't have dependents. I can afford to be more dynamic. I can afford to take more financial risks. The flip side of that is that I don't live with my partner, so I am the only income coming into my household, which means I can be less dynamic and can afford to take risks less. So what should a freelance income look like? Well, what I've got on the slide is a quote from HMRC Advice, which talks about, I don't know if you all know this, probably lots of you do. If you don't, it's one of the best bits of tax advice I was ever given, which is that freelancers can average your income across 2 years for tax purposes, which means that you can pay a more even amount of tax across years. The reason for this is that quite often artists are assumed to be making work 1 year, and then the next year will be kind of doing events and selling the work and making the money off that work. And then the next year they might go back to making work and therefore not have much of an income. And this allows you to even it out. Coincidentally, it's the only other category that this applies to is farmers, which means that tax advisors and accountants in this county are excellent and experts at advising artists. One of those brilliant coincidences. So a freelance income ought to, in an ideal world, look a bit like this. So this is a graph of a kind of annual income, which looks a bit like a W. So it's high 1 year, low the next, high the next year, low the next, and high the 5th year. And that's kind of how it ought to go on in an ideal world. The figures on here are what my income probably ought to have been for 2018, 19, 19, 20, 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23. So the last 5 tax years, including this one. So what has my income actually looked like? Well, the W here is a little bit flatter. We have the high in 2018-19, going down to the low in 1920, pretty similarly low in 2021, pretty similarly low in 21-22, and climbing back up not quite to the full height it was before, but a little bit higher in 22-23. Obviously, there's a really obvious explanation for this, which is COVID. That middle year was the year that COVID hit, and I think we're all still feeling the effects of it. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit when we're talking about the cost of living crisis, is that it's not just cost of living, it's cost of living plus COVID. I'm aware this is getting into kind of really negative territory, but I think it's worth talking about, I think it's worth raising. Because actually the effect of the cost of living crisis is compounded by the fact that freelancers, and obviously I know this isn't just about freelancers, this is across the sectors, applying to everybody, but particularly just remembering freelancers kind of at the bottom of that rung, is that we're already struggling financially. You know, as you saw in that kind of graph before, that middle year, which should have been high, was low. So we're already coming off the back of having to use a lot of savings to kind of sustain ourselves, really. So we're struggling financially. There is reduced funding available, partly because of cost of living, and that's not, I'm aware that the Arts Council are here, and that I'm not specifically talking about the Arts Council, I'm talking about general funding. You know, there are avenues of funding that were open before that are no longer open to us, because everyone has to look after themselves and protect themselves, which is understandable, but it obviously adds to the fact that we are already struggling financially. Thinking particularly about my own industry, publishing has a massive backlog. There are all kinds of books that should have come out during COVID that were pushed back, and it just means that everything is kind of getting pushed back and back and back. And everyone in publishing, like every freelancer, is exhausted, which adds to that backlog. The work available actually still isn't at former levels. That might just be what I've found. It's starting to get back up there, but a lot of things that were happening are still not happening. Things that closed during COVID, organisations that changed tack during COVID. There's a lot of work still not quite available. Also, one of the things that happened during COVID was this devaluing of artistic content. A lot of organisations, right from kind of massive national organisations and international organisations, right down to kind of individual freelancers, created free content during COVID. And this was brilliant, and it gave so many people amazing access to the arts that they wouldn't already or ordinarily have had. But the result of that means that there's so much available for free that people have become unused to paying for content and to paying for events and paying for things. And that's great from an access point of view, but actually if that still kind of carries over to the freelancers and freelancers are expected to do the work for free, obviously that's not great for artists. So we need to kind of look at models to solve that problem as well. There's still, I think, limited accessibility. It's great that these are being filmed, and there are a lot of events that are not being, that have gone back to being completely in person with no access for anyone who is still shielding. And he was talking about the huge numbers of people who are still shielding, and I think it's quite easy to forget about those people. And actually, there's a risk of reinfection that comes with that. And with every risk of reinfection, I know we all know this, there's long COVID. I've just had to scoff a custard cream because I have long COVID, often before I speak, or if I get too hot or anything where adrenaline is running high. I get kind of lightheadedness, kind of POTS symptoms, and also forget words. That hasn't happened yet, but obviously it can be a problem when your trade is words. So that's something that people are dealing with. And all of that kind of comes together to mean that we are physically and emotionally exhausted. And again, I know this isn't just freelancers, it's everyone. But actually the upshot of that is that a lot of us have very limited capacity to be dynamic. Like, I think we all want to be, you know, all artists want to be dynamic because that's what art is. Art is about breaking down barriers, it's about doing things differently, it's about thinking outside the box. But actually when you're exhausted, when you're struggling financially, often there isn't the headspace to be dynamic. And I think that's worth mentioning. Okay, so let's be a bit more positive and think about how I actually am making a living and how freelancers can make a living. Tom talks about my graphs, my pie charts. I'm a big fan of a pie chart, anything that's colour coordinated. So what we have on the board is my pie chart for this year, 2022-23, unless the kind of last minute, you know, prize that's going to give me £15,000 or something comes in. This is my income for this current tax year. 42%, the biggest chunk of it does come directly from funding, or has this year. That's been from Arts Council funding, from a Developing a Creative Practice Fund, and also largely from the Northern Writers Awards. That's kind of the two kind of bulk sections of that. But also in there we've got, you know, writing itself at 17%. That's things like advances on books, it's things like prizes for writing that's been done, it's things like commissions. 21% has come from residencies, so being paid to go to a place and write, which is a great gig, by the way. and 7% from events such as this, 3% from facilitation, that's set to go up next year. Oh no, I got this the wrong way around, the colours are too similar, sorry, 3% from residencies, that makes more sense, 21% from facilitation. God, I'd love 21% of my income. Even as I said it, I was like, God, I've forgotten some amazing residency gig I must have got this year. No, that makes more sense. And 10% this year has come from admin, which is something that I've just started doing again. And part of that is to do with the cost of living crisis and having to kind of have more strings to my bow. So if we compare that to the last 4 years, I'm aware they're quite small, but it's kind of the colours that I want to focus on. So we've got the last 4 years of incomes, 2019, 2020, 2021 and 2022-23. I'm aware there's a discrepancy there. I've gone from going annual to going to tax year, so there's 3 months missing. The biggest things that I want to draw your attention to on there are 2019, the biggest chunk of my income was coming from my actual writing. That's no longer the case. Partly that was because that was when my novel came out, so it was just sort of, you know, a circumstance. But it has decreased over those 3 years, and some of that is linked to that long COVID that I was talking about as well, and actually working slower in terms of my own creativity. 2020, obviously funding was a massive source of income because there was the COVID support and all of the work pretty much died away, so that makes sense. But what I think is really interesting from my point of view is that sort of the chunk of green which represents admin on this current year's pie chart, which is not really there on any of the others, and for me that is an indication of having to sort of diversify it and having to have more strings to my bow. So what does it mean to be dynamic? Well, for me it's about looking outside the box to find work, and it's about creating my own work. So not just waiting for work to come into my inbox, which is obviously lovely when it does happen, but going out there and finding it. So things like making pitches, pitching to organisations, things like putting in applications for things. It's amazing how many writers I talk to who say, how did you get that residency gig? That must be so nice. And they say, well, I just applied for it. There was a call out and I just submitted an application. Google is brilliant for that. I sit down with a glass of wine every few weeks and just Google opportunities for writers or some variation of that. And it's surprising what it throws up. Using existing networks like this one obviously is brilliant for finding work, but also looking for new networks, finding partnerships outside of the sector. Rob and Harriet Fraser, who many of you will know, are doing amazing work on that in terms of finding work and getting funding from outside of the sector. Creating your own work, just going out there and sort of, you know, running opportunities, running workshops is something that I quite often do. And when work does come into your inbox, say yes. That's been my kind of mantra, and it seems to work. The flip side of that, I said I was going to talk about flip sides, is that unpaid work require you to take a gamble and require you to take yourself away from that artistic focus. If you're constantly searching for new networks, if you're constantly pitching, submitting applications, and looking for new partnerships, then that is something that can take you away from that creative work and can take up a lot of that headspace, which, as we've already talked about, is really limited, especially at the moment. So I just want to finish on how can the cultural sector support artists. Now, this is a kind of wish list. Obviously, I'm aware that, you know, it's not just freelancers who are exhausted and who have a limited capacity, but since I had this opportunity to stand up here, I thought I would give you my wish list. Funding to write and create work. I know that Ireland has just implemented the basic income for artists, which they're kind of trialling at the moment. That would be amazing, just pointing that out. That would be wonderful. And actually, I think sometimes the funding does have to come before being dynamic. I think both actually work. I think you have to have the vision before you can apply for the funding, but sometimes the funding can give you that security and that time and that headspace to actually think through that vision and to actually do that creative work rather than when you're not just sort of kind of running around trying to pay bills. Arts organisations and the cultural sector generally, it's great when organisations are being upfront about pay and how to invoice. Universities are actually dreadful for this. They tell you the pay, and then you do the work, and then about 3 months later they send you all these forms that you should have known, that you should have filled in, and also you have to go to the city where the university is based to show them your passport for 2 minutes, unpaid. Universities are terrible for that. Upfront about how to pay, about what the pay is, how to invoice, upfront about the work involved. Some of the best models I've seen, actually the Fell Foot Forward project was great for this, in that they asked me to plan a project so that they could submit a funding bid, and they paid me for that planning time before they submitted the funding bid. Now that's great, because it means that actually I'm not the one, as the freelancer, carrying the risk of that funding bid not coming off. It did come off and I got the work, and it's brilliant. I think giving artists a mix of project sizes, offering a mix of kind of regular and one-off work is really, really great. I've talked about Words with Grasmere. I've got regular work with them at the moment, running Dove Cottage Young Poets and Untrodden Ways young people's groups. I also get kind of one-off work from them with one-off schools workshops as well. What happens a lot, I noticed over lockdown, was that people were saying that there was this kind of idea that money should be, because artists were struggling, money should be split across as many artists as possible. So if you had a £10,000 budget for a project, you wouldn't give that £10,000 to one artist, you'd open it up to 10 artists to each pitch for £1,000, which is great in theory, but what that meant was that actually you had to do the same amount of application and unpaid work in order to get a tenth of the money. So I think a mix of project sizes is really good, and this thing of asking people to do less for more money rather than to do more work for less money, to work in a more focused way on a project rather than spreading ourselves too thinly. And we kind of know this, but since it's my wish list, I thought I'd put it up there. Being upfront about access as well, you know, we've talked about all the people who are still shielding. Being upfront and offering access is, I think, really useful for artists. And actually, if you say straight away what the access is and what the pay is, it means that it's one email rather than kind of 5 back and forward emails asking what the situation is. And similarly, minimising that unpaid planning, pitching and applying time that we've just talked about. What would be ideal as well is offering kind of artist development that is linked to existing practice. So quite often there's that work that takes you away from your kind of existing practice. So I'm a writer, I've got a poetry collection coming out, I'm working on a novel. What I really ideally want to do is other work that links in with what I'm already doing. Obviously that's not always possible, and I know that organisations have their own kind of existing practice that they need to uphold as well. But hey, this is a wish list. And just keep providing amazing opportunities for artists. So obviously talking about being dynamic, standing here in front of you with these slides, so obviously I'm going to tell you that I've got a book coming out and another novel which was published in 2019. That big grey chunk of the pie chart that came from writing in 2019, that was it, that novel there, My Name is Monster. That was where that money came from. Poetry pays less well. I'm sure that's not news to anyone. But on the left we have the cover for White Ghosts, which is my poetry collection, which is coming out at the end of the month. Yeah, that's my pitch. Come buy a copy, come hear me read from it. That's basically me. I am on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and the most dynamic of all social media sites, TikTok. I don't think I'm very dynamic on TikTok, I'm still getting to grips with it, but here we go. Thank you very much for having me and for letting me speak. We're not going to do questions, I think we're going to go straight into the coffee break, but if anyone does have any questions, do feel free to come up and chat to me outside, and it'd be great to talk. Thank you very much.